canal while fishing. Officer Hess, Sergeant Hess, doffed his boots, his belt, and his hat, and his jacket, and dove in and rescued that young man when it was said he was going down for his third and final time. Now, there were numerous mill injuries. Here we had the C. Ross Ray flour mill. We had the Sissel and Hare mills over here. We had machine shops and other types of foundries and all that sprung up here because they drew water from the canal to power the water wheels that operated the mills. Well, Jacob Walker was sewing a bag of fertilizer in the bone mill of F.L. Moore over here when his shirt sleeve got caught in a vertical shaft of the mill and started spinning him around. Well, a thoughtful co-worker was able to shield his head on each rotation he came around so that his head did not hit a nearby beam until they were able to shut down the machinery and disengage his clothing from that shaft. Unfortunately, his arm could not be saved, but his life was spared. Not so lucky was Christian Sigmund. Christian Sigmund worked over here at the Hare and Sissel mill. He fell into the massive cogs of the mill and was crushed. It said back then that all three of Georgetown's most prominent physicians, Kleinschmidt, Appleby, and Dr. Badesco Williams, worked in vain to try to save this man's life, but in the end all they could do was stitch him up and send his body, once he had passed away, over to Mr. Birch, our neighborhood undertaker. Now, if you will, we're going to walk down to the shadows of Francis Scott Key's house and the house of Henry Foxhall. Very industrial, yes, this entire area. And interesting that you should ask, madam, because here, in the shadows of Henry Foxhall's old mansion, which later fell into disrepair and became a rather renowned brothel or flop house, if you will, Francis Scott Key's house, which stood on the other side of the canal up here, the more urban portion of Georgetown, industrial Georgetown here, gave way to the more rural and rustic area as we go upstream of the canal. Now, as we got on the outskirts of the village of Georgetown, that didn't mean that crime and incidents became any less frequent. There was a case of two employees who worked for the Joseph Collins Company. They were up here on Fayette Street, I believe, when they got into an argument, and one struck the other one in the head with his hoe. And they said that he struck the subject so hard it cleaved his head almost in half, his skull almost in half. Miraculously, the gentleman survived. I think many times these early reports are somewhat exaggerated. There's a very unfortunate case of the Lee brothers. These two young men, both in their mid-20s, lived up at the top of Frederick Street near its intersection with High Street. For years and years and years, an old Revolutionary-era musket hung over their parents' mantelpiece in their living room. And for years and years and years, these boys, as they grew up and even through their teenage years, would from time to time take this musket down off the wall and dry fire it and point it at the window at birds or each other or whatever. Well, why should these two boys' behavior change as they entered into their 20s? Unfortunately, one day, Frank took the musket off the wall and pointed at his brother Ted, pulled the trigger, and the resulting blast not only startled him, but covered his brother in soot, ball striking him in the chest and knocking him across the room. When Frank went over to his brother to see how he was doing, his brother Ted looked up and said, "Oh, brother, I am gone," and breathed his last breath. Very, very sad. A good lesson for people not to assume that firearms are ever safe. Jerry Donovan was beaten to death up by 2nd Street and Lincoln Lane, just on the southeast corner of Georgetown College. It was said that his wife pleaded with Daniel McCarthy, his assailant, to stop the assault on her husband. Finally, McCarthy fled and Mr. Donovan died several hours later. We'll hear a little bit more about this case later. There was a domestic tragedy just 2 blocks up the street here on Prospect Street off of Fayette Street. Isaac Bell and his wife Ann, late one night, were having an argument. They were arguing over the last cigarette in their house and who was going to get it. It would seem to me that if you have one cigarette and you both smoke, why couldn't you share it? But no, the Bells had to argue over this cigarette. Their verbal confrontation became one of a physical confrontation, and Isaac slapped his wife across the face with his open hand, and she fell onto their bed. Dead. We'll find out later what happened to Isaac Bell and the post-mortem examination of poor Ann Bell. Now, if you will, unless somebody is bothered by heights, we'd like to walk up here onto the Frederick Street Bridge and talk about some of the incidents that happened involving the Aqueduct Bridge and our crime of the decade here in more rustic areas out here. Indifference seemed to be the name of the game back then. Indifference to the maintenance of structures, indifference to co-workers and to employees. Now, these gentlemen are going to pass by. Come ahead, please. This mule crossing bridge that we're standing on now was frequently knocked from its foundations and fell into the canal, knocked by these 140-ton canal boats. However, the canal company was very prompt in repairing it because the obstruction in the canal, of course, hindered the commerce that the canal company relied on through tolls to keep the canal operating. So there was this indifference to structures. Nothing more apparent than the Alexandria Aqueduct Bridge. Now, the Alexandria Aqueduct carried the C&O Canal over the Potomac River from 1843 up until the Civil War, when it was drained and used for troop movements, and then was rewatered after the Civil War. In the late 1860s, a superstructure was built onto the aqueduct to carry horses and pedestrians. And just to give you an idea, in the last 6 months of 1869, 117,723 foot passengers crossed over the aqueduct bridge, 4,606 horses with riders, 18,422 wagons of all kinds, 2,524 head of cattle, 9,043 sheep, 30 hogs. It was quite a busy bridge. Now, citizens and the people that used that bridge complained because the owners of the bridge, who was privately held, complained that the wooden structures of the bridge were not properly maintained. And never was that more evident than on one afternoon when Gil Hare was driving some of his cattle across from Arlington on the other side of the Potomac River, ostensibly to go out to the market there at Drover's Rest, when the planks gave way on the bridge and 30 head of his cattle plunged into the C&O Canal. But they were all rescued successfully, and Mr. Furr was on his way with his cattle. There were several cases related to the United States Army Signal Corps operation over in Arlington Heights. One day, 3 young officers came over to repair the telegraph lines that ran out along the canal, when one of them, Job Craig, decided that was his day to desert the Army. And he took off running out the towpath with his 2 comrades firing shots at him, but none of the shots took hold, and he was later taken into custody up near Harper's Ferry. Enoch Barkus, he and a couple of his co-workers were off duty and were coming over the aqueduct bridge, probably to imbibe in some alcohol spirits in one of the fine saloons here in Georgetown, when without warning, Enoch flung himself off of the aqueduct bridge into the cold waters of the Potomac River below. His body was found several days later down near the mouth to Rock Creek. There was an unfortunate case in which 3 young men were in a rowboat down on the Potomac River, and you have to picture this aqueduct bridge at the height of the canal, about 38 feet above the Potomac River, carrying the canal boats and mules over the river. And it was a wooden trunk in this aqueduct, and it was not watertight. A lot of water spilled out of and leaked from the aqueduct bridge, causing these large water plumes. These boys were rowing their rowboat, rowed too close to the water plumes. The water started to fill the boat. They panicked, the boat capsized, and all three of them perished. Their bodies were eventually found over at Mason's Island, and again down near the Mount Rock Creek. Very, very unfortunate. Up at Georgetown College, there was an unfortunate case of a suicide up there. They weren't too sure it was a suicide. They thought that perhaps Matthew LeClaire had been sitting on the windowsill of his dormitory room when perhaps he fell or slipped. But the investigation of the police department finally concluded that, in fact, Matthew LeClaire came to his demise at his own hands. That is because in his room was found a picture, a photograph of his mother, on which was written, "Dearest Mother, tomorrow night I will be joining you in heaven." Clue number one. Clue number two was a note found among Mr. LeClaire's effects that said, and I quote, "There will be but one class of people who will rejoice at my death, and that would be the restaurant and barkeeps of Georgetown, as they will no longer have to trust me for payment." Obviously, Mr. LeClaire's problem arose from his love of alcohol. Now, here is a case that I am somewhat reluctant to call to everyone's attention because it reflects so poorly on Durham Metropolitan Police Department back then at the time. But it is a case of murder most foul, murder most terrible. About a quarter of a mile up Falls Road here was the Green Spring Pavilion, right near the site of Henry Foxhall's old foundry. It was situated there because even on hot summer nights, cool breezes came down through the ravine and acted to condition the air and make it cool. There was a dance pavilion there. In fact, the German community of Washington often used it for their Oktoberfest and Schützenfests. One night, July 22nd, 1872, there was such an event going on. One of our officers, Officer Charlie O'Brien, he was about 26 years of age, was on duty at the Green Spring Pavilion when he encountered Samuel Cunningham and Mrs. Cunningham, acquaintances of his. Now you see, Samuel Cunningham's brother, William, was also a member of the Metropolitan Police Department and worked with Charlie O'Brien at the 3rd District Police Station. It seems that Charlie O'Brien had heard that Samuel Cunningham was interested in getting into the career of law enforcement and had put him in touch with the supervisor of the High Reservoir up at High Street and Road Street, which supplied, that's General Meggs's reservoir that he designed, that supplied drinking water to Georgetown. Put him in touch with the superintendent up there in hopes of getting a part-time job for Mr. Cunningham. Then he could apply to the Metropolitan Police Department. See, Samuel Cunningham worked right down here at the Borden Mining Company. He'd been described as a rather inoffensive young man. Well, Charlie O'Brien went up and engaged Mr. and Mrs. Cunningham in idle conversation. And during this conversation, it's alleged that Charlie O'Brien said something to the effect that, "Well, now that I have procured employment for your husband, Mrs. Cunningham, I should hope that there would be some favors coming my way." Obviously, Mrs. Cunningham was insulted by this. Mr. Cunningham said words, which I'm sure he would later regret, which impugned the reputation of Officer O'Brien's wife prior to their marriage a couple of years earlier. This argument escalated and escalated until it came to fisticuffs, and the two men were rolling about on the ground fighting, and it took several men to come and separate them and break up the fight. Police Department's own Lieutenant Essex came over and relieved Charlie O'Brien of his badge and of his nightstick and sent him up onto the pavilion porch to cool off and to maintain and regain his composure, and relieved him of duty that night. The Cunninghams, it said, after they regained their composure, did so to such a degree they went back and enjoyed another dance out on the dance floor. when it was reported that as they were walking back from the dance floor, Mrs. Cunningham said she became aware of a hand reaching over her shoulder. And in that hand was a gun. 2 shots were fired, and the resulting blasts went in to Samuel Cunningham's head, killing him instantly. Charlie O'Brien was taken into custody and transported down to the 3rd District Police Station, charged with the murder of his acquaintance and his co-worker's brother, Samuel Cunningham. Terrible, terrible story, and we will hear more about this at our next 2 and final stops. Now here we are at the back of the old Georgetown market. The market, of course, was a place where people gathered and gossiped and exchanged news and information. And of course, it was again a venue for crime and one for opportunists to take advantage of. Officer Sebastian, again, he was assaulted one day here at the market. He was arresting William Williams and James Parker. Now, why he tried to take on 2 people at one time was a mystery. Eventually, Officer Green came to his assistance, and with his help, they subdued both subjects. There was a reckless rider on horseback down Fall Street here. He was riding so recklessly as to endanger people and other riders and pedestrians. 19-year-old J.H. Kaiser. He was arrested by officers Jones and Harper for furiously riding a horse down Fall Street. The interesting thing about this case was, and he must have been a spoiled sort, because it was reported at the time that amid tears of protest in the police station, he complained about the indignity of being arrested by a lot so lowly as the police. Well, perhaps if he weren't riding so furiously, he wouldn't have had to suffer those indignities. There were repeated complaints about the poor conditions of the stairs and the Potomac Street Bridge here. It was declared often a death trap. Now, you remember we had the earlier case of the woman that fell from the bridge. This is Tucker, I believe her name was. Well, as we go down these stairs here, I just ask you to mind your steps and hold on to the handrails, please. Right up here on the corner of Potomac Street and Fall Street was a shooting affray. It grew out of a gambling argument between William Nicholson and Hillary Hutchins. They got into an argument, obviously over whether one of them was cheating or one of them had not paid his debt at the end of the game, whatever they were doing. Mr. Nicholson was pursued down Fall Street towards High Street by Mr. Hutchins. Finally, he turned, reached into his belt, and pulled a small pistol and warned Hillary Hutchins, "Don't take another step or I will shoot." He did, the bullet entering Hillary Hutchins' mouth and lodging in the back of his neck. Now, interestingly enough, Dr. Williams, he was taken over to Cropley's store and examined by Dr. Badesco Williams, who said that his wound was not of a serious nature. Well, I guess he was wrong, because 3 days later, Hillary Hutchins died of his injury, and a warrant was sought for Mr. Nicholson. And we'll hear a little bit more about that case at the end of our trip in our next stop. Now, there was a robbery of a butcher's stall up here. A string of sausages was taken. The thief ran out of here and down the stairs onto the towpath, where he was pursued by none other than Sergeant Hess. Now, you will recall Sergeant Hess was the hero that pulled the young fisherman out of the canal and saved his life. Well, Sergeant Hess was rather courtly in nature. Some people said that that's what allowed him to rescue that young man, that he provided some buoyancy. In this case, they believed that it was not so much the apprehension of the thief, but the loss of that bundle of sausages that motivated Sergeant Hess when he finally overcame the subject, arrested him, and returned the sausages to the butcher's stall up here at the market. Now, James Taylor was a subject who was hard to take down. This is another case of police officers not waiting till the proper time to take action. It was a case when Lieutenant Skipper and our station clerk, a civilian, noticed that James Taylor, who had warrants for him, was here right in Dennis Caddy's restaurant. when they attempted to effect the arrest. Well, apparently Mr. Taylor wanted to have nothing to do with that and put up a struggle. Eventually, other officers arrived, including Officer Harper, and again, Officer Sebastian, who was obviously always around this area. They said that they finally subdued the subject, and by the time they got him down the street to the 3rd District Police Station, he put up such a struggle that he had nary a piece of clothing left on him. Now here's an update on former police officer Charlie O'Brien. On November 14, 1872, after deliberating 4 hours, a jury of his peers found Charlie O'Brien guilty of the murder of Samuel Cunningham. On November 29th, Judge MacArthur sentenced Charlie O'Brien to death by hanging, the sentence to be carried out February 27, 1873. In the meantime, Lieutenant Essex, who you will recall relieved Charlie O'Brien of his nightstick and his badge on that night in question, had come under a great deal of ridicule for not acting further and taking Officer O'Brien's gun away from him. Resulted in so much criticism that he was eventually reassigned as the commander of the 3rd District here and given a position in the Division of Sanitation in police headquarters downtown. That would be like the Health and Welfare Division at the time. And we will hear more about the outcome of this case at our final stop back at the 3rd District Police Station. If you will accompany me, please. Gone over today as we wind down our beat here, walking along, accompanying me. This represents such a small amount of the activity, but it's not to impugn the fine people that live here in Georgetown. Most of the 12,500 residents go about their business every day, unmolested and safe on their streets and at work and in their residences as well. Now we have some follow-ups to some of our cases, now that we're back here at the 3rd District Station. Isaac Bell, you will recall he struck his wife Ann across the face in the dispute over the last cigarette in the house. Interestingly enough, the coroner's jury determined that Ann Bell, his wife, died of natural causes. And the fact that Isaac had struck her was a mere coincidence, that she probably would have died anyhow. Isaac was released and returned home to his awaiting children. Daniel McCarthy, you recall he was assaulting Jerry Donovan over the protest of Jerry Donovan's wife. Even into the late 1870s, Daniel McCarthy was never apprehended for that case of murder. The case against William Nicholson and his killing of Hillary Hutchins, remember, over the gambling dispute. It was determined by the coroner's jury that Mr. Nicholson acted in self-defense in turning and firing the shot that killed Hillary Hutchins. Interestingly enough, it was also determined that back in 1861, Hillary Hutchins had served a stint of 1 year in the D.C. jail over at the Blue Jug for the crime of theft. So he was not an upstanding citizen as it was. Lieutenant Essex, who was the station commander that failed to act responsibly in the case of Charlie O'Brien, finally succumbed to consumption at his residence on January 20th, 1875, at the age of 45, leaving a widow and 4 young children. Now, the case of Charlie O'Brien. Charlie O'Brien's request for a new trial was overturned or denied on February 4th, 1873. But on February 21st, President Ulysses S. Grant granted a respite until after his inauguration, based on letters that he had received through the Attorney General, who Charlie O'Brien had served at the very end of the Civil War. General Grant commuted Charlie O'Brien's death sentence to one of life in prison, and on March 31st, he was taken by train to the state penitentiary in Albany, New York, where he resided until his eventual death right after the turn of the century. Now, a little bit about Ernest W. Brown. Interestingly enough, Ernest Brown was promoted to sergeant in the Metropolitan Police Department in 1906, a mere 10 years after he joined the police department, and he was put in charge of the department's vice squad. I'm sure a lot of the lessons he learned back over here in Hungry Hill and Paradise Flats, paid off in that he became the head of the vice squad. He was promoted in 1917 and again in 1920 to lieutenant and then to captain. In 1925, he was promoted to inspector and put in charge of the newly formed traffic division of the Metropolitan Police Department. Then in 1932, he was promoted, finally, to major / superintendent of police. He was the very first police chief of the Metropolitan Police Department to have gained that rank, rising all the way through the ranks. Up until that time, all the police chiefs for the Metropolitan Police Department had been appointed from outside and were generally retired Army officials or people sort of owed favors by the commissioners. So he was the very first police officer to start as a walking beat here in Georgetown to end up as the chief of police in 1932. He started the Police Boys Club, which later became the Police Boys and Girls Club. Camp Ernest W. Brown down the Potomac River in St. Mary's County in Lower Maryland is named after him. He oversaw the public safety strategies, if you will, for all three of President Franklin Roosevelt's inaugural events. He was the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police for a year in 1940, and he retired from the police department in November of 1941. He gave the interview to Jay Johnson in March of 1960 for National Geographic magazine, and he died in 1966 at the age of 96 years. So that's the story of Ernest W. Brown, what some of the crime and disorder was like down here in Georgetown during the 1870s, and I appreciate you joining me today to learn more about our park and the area here in Georgetown. Thank you very much.
Well done.
Anybody have any questions that I can answer either in or out of character? So many people have asked questions over and someone else asked, I don't know if you heard, what was the policy has? Numbers running, numbers racket, lotteries. Today we have lotteries, things nothing other than they were illegal about
When do you do it like this?
Oh, just as recently as the 60s, as the 1960s. And this area here, both of these structures were all part of the streetcar system. This was a market beforehand, and on the other side of the police station was a market. And then as the parcels were accumulated and bought up by the Capital Traction Company, the railroad company, it became the car barns and administrative offices and all, and the powerhouse on the other side.
When did Georgetown become part of Washington?
Oh, I knew that someone would ask me that. It was, of course, Georgetown was here long before Washington. It was established in 1751. The police district that we were part of was everything this side of Rock Creek from the Potomac River up to about what is now Calvert Street, okay, or a little bit beyond. And out west, probably no further than maybe where the Georgetown Reservoir is now, or that Drover's Rest, Whitehaven Parkway. Beyond that, it was Washington County. Okay, or Frederick County. Frederick sort of north and Washington this way, I believe. All the movement to bring Washington into the fold of the District of Columbia happened in the 1870s. And a lot of the accounts I came across in the Evening Star while doing the research for this was over the Georgetown Assemblyman's protests over being taken over. And, it's sad because all those streets I named, I mean, there's some pictures as recently in tour books and all from 1950s that have the conventional street signs on, and then below would say Gay Street or Montgomery Street or High Street, and those have all gone. I'm kind of surprised that Georgetown, particularly with the resurgence it's enjoyed, that the Business Improvement District or someone hasn't gone and put up those historic street signs. I mean, I've memorized all the streets north and south, and to keep the talk authentic, I try not to refer to them in their current terms, but all that transition and all was done by the late 1890s. It's the confirmation of the street names and everything. Anything else? Well, we certainly had a great day weather-wise. I'll tell you what, there were a few days back in July and all when Ernest was a little steamed under his wool uniform. But again, thank you all very much for joining us. I know we met down at the Georgetown Visitor Center. Someone asked if we were going back that way. Yes, I am. I'm just going to walk down the stairs. Please feel free to accompany me back there. If not, you're 1 block south of M Street on Wisconsin Avenue here, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much for joining us. Nice job, Bill. Did you like that, Wally? Put the mules out on the tow path. Some people rode them, other people walked with them, okay? And people think that's a real good idea until you do the math that there were 550 boats times 4 mules by my calculation is 2,200 mules, okay, that park rangers did not go out and clean up after every day. So this tow path was just solid mule waste, if you will, and Mom and Dad didn't want you wasting your good Sunday shoes wearing them out on the tow path, so you were probably out there barefooted. Yeah, there you go. Now let me direct your attention. Now, we had to dig this canal. Look at this stone outcropping over here, this natural outcropping of stone. In the upper right-hand corner there, you can see a couple of like man-made slashes down through the stone. This was the type of geological obstruction the Irish, mainly Irish immigrant laborers that came upon were forced to have to hack through to dig this canal. You have to remember, back in the 1820s and 1830s, there were no backhoes, there were plenty of backs, and there were hoes, there were pickaxes, there were sledgehammers, there were wheelbarrow, oxen, horse, mules, but there were no jackhammers, no steam shovels, no dynamite. The only thing they had for blasting purposes was black powder. Now, when they came across an obstruction like that, what they would use was a rather simple tool similar to this called a star bit. Okay? This one, these tools I actually dug out of my grandfather's toolbox. He was a stonemason and cement worker on the Lincoln Memorial and some other places here in the district. But anyhow, I dug this up because it had a connection for me with the laborers who were building the canal. Now, they didn't use a little 3-pound mallet like this. They used big 20-pound sledgehammers, you know, the ones with the long handle, okay, and working teams of 3. The objective being that one person, usually the person who drew the short straw, okay, got to hold the star bit against the stone, okay, with the idea being that with each couple of bangs of the sledgehammer on this nickel-sized target, and believe me, if you've ever tried to start a nail in a board and missed and hit your finger, multiply that by about 1,000,000, okay? As these guys were swinging these sledgehammers, trying to hit this, the job of Mr. Turner would be to turn this star bit to get a bite in the stone, drilling a hole down so that it could be filled with black powder at a fuse and wadding, light it, and the resulting explosion would fracture a piece of the rock off so that it was either more manageable and could be broken up by more sledgehammers, or having to go through the whole process again. So here these guys are, okay, now, these were, you know, young and old alike Irish immigrant workers, sometimes sick with cholera, certainly fatigued. This is a hot, nasty area to work in. Perhaps hung over from their ration of whiskey the night before, but they were going to work as a team, okay? But these guys were wielding these big sledgehammers over their heads, okay, trying to hit this, I can't even do it, trying to hit this very small target while the guy turned it and turned it to take a bite into that rock. So all up and down the canal, you could hear the chorus of these sledgehammers against these bits, okay? So bit by bit by bit, working as teams, okay, teams of 3s, these guys put their trust in these real simple tools in each other to reduce stone outcroppings like you saw there to rubble, manageable piles of rubble, so that they could clear it and create this 185-mile-long water right-of-way, which brought commerce and prosperity to the merchants and all here of Georgetown, provided a way of life for these families that operated the boats, and while it wasn't a big money maker, okay, brought some sense of business and all to the owners and the investors of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company. So just think about that, you know, all that work to dig out this canal.
Okay.